Good morning, everyone. And so I was asked to speak a little bit about, sort of future trends, really more from a technology bent. And so, before I get started, this is my established credibility slide. Who am I? So I am a venture capitalist right now, and I'll talk a little bit about my firm afterwards. So I've actually been in Silicon Valley now for almost 20 years, have actually done startups for a couple years, and actually have spent 10 and a half years at Yahoo as a corporate executive. So I'm one of you. I'm actually used to be one of you. And now, actually, I am investing in early-stage startups, and so have been sort of like on all different sides of the table here in Silicon Valley. 500 startups, if you do not know who we are an early-stage venture capital fund. I would say, and when I say early stage, it's not Series A. We're investing in companies. We're usually the first check-in companies. And we have been around now for about 8 years and have invested in over 2,000 startups, actually, over the last 8 years. I think the other thing that makes us a little bit different is the fact that we actually are one of the very few Silicon Valley VCs that actually invests outside of the US. So about 40 to 45% of portfolio is actually outside the US. And because of this gives us a very, very interesting, both the early stage sort of series that we actually invest in, as well as the global nature of sort of our investing. We have a very, very unique view of actually what's going on in the technology world. And ultimately, if you think about the technology world, why this is important, the technology world actually impacts everything that we do now, right? And this was, I would say, was always the case, I think, in civilization, but I'd say more so has come up to sort of more of the forefront. And so if you look at sort of what has been happening, pre-18th agricultural age, right? If you look at the 19th and 20th century, just to give some context, we were actually in the industrial age. In the 21st century, the reality is that we're moving into a completely new way of doing business and living in general, computing power and human potential. And this actually leaves sort of, as I mentioned to you, sort of there's a great quote from William Gibson. He's actually one of the best sci-fi writers, in my opinion, one of the best sci-fi writers around. This great quote, which is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And this is actually something I see a lot. So for example, a lot of the new things that are happening in Silicon Valley, there's a lag time of actually when this gets to the rest of the world, for better or for worse. So for example, I spend a lot of time on the East Coast. I see a lot of the type of startups and trends that actually happen in Silicon Valley probably start to show up on the East Coast about 9 to 12 months later on. And then it moves over to Europe probably about, I'd say probably 6 months to like about a year afterwards. And then it kind of goes to the rest of the world. And I would say, with the exception of China, China is a completely weird and different beast. And what I would also say as well, too, is that because of this, I travel all over the world. It's interesting, sort of, you can actually, it's almost like being sort of the man from the future, and you go to certain parts of like Europe or certain parts of Latin America, and hey, like, especially with the demographic trends and these things happening, like this thing will eventually be important. These payment services will eventually be important. These type of like online marketing services will be important. You have this very, very interesting window. And so, I just want to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit also about history, right? And stuff that should be very, very obvious. But 11 years ago, remember the iPhone actually came out. This is 11 years ago. Think about the impact the iPhone actually as a smartphone actually had on the world overall, right? On commerce, on really any trends. And smartphone growth continues to grow overall. And the other thing, too, is that, and why this slide is interesting, you look at the breakdown between iOS and Android, is that, and why I put this slide in, is that, number one, growth is overall continuing, but I think what you see in technology trends is that you see an oligopoly sort of like, sort of really, really tend to dominate, tends to sort of consolidate around two major players that actually dominate as a technology platform. And of course, because of smartphones, internet user growth will continue across the globe. And so, everything that we've seen right now, we're expecting several more billion people to come online, particularly from a lot of the emerging markets. And so this will impact all of business. And if you are interested in sort of more of this like future sort of like viewing, these are actually 3 books that I highly, highly recommend. Flash Foresight, Daniel Burrus, he's a good friend. He's been one of the best, I think, forecasters on the planet. Alec Ross, which he talks about a lot of the new future industries like biotechnology, nanotechnology, energy. And of course, the Signals are talking. She's actually from Silicon Valley. And she talks about like how you look at sort of the emerging landscape to get pieces of information to help come up with a hypothesis on where the world is going. And so a couple driving trends, all right? Number one, billions of new middle class coming online all across the world, right? Number two, the rise of cloud services. You know, this wonderful thing, you remember the old days of like, you know, desktop computing, right? Like most software now, not most, but a good portion of software right now is actually found on the cloud. And so that has actually changed how business is actually being done. Other thing too, is mobile is dominant, so this 4G adoption is like fairly wide. 5G is coming too, and that is only going to push more mobile adoption in the mobile internet. And because of this, mobile commerce is also starting to emerge as a fast-growing sort of trend, which will affect all your businesses. Social media and apps are effective partitions of actually what people are using and actually doing. So you're seeing a lot more specialization here. And because of this, it's actually generating a lot of data, right? You know, all these partitions, all this stuff that's happening is generating a lot of data. And so I'm going to utilize, you know, I'm going to talk about sort of these various trends over the next, next couple of minutes. And because of this, right, you know, it's not just one trend that's actually happening. It's actually all these multitude trends have actually coming together, which is actually driving tremendous, tremendous change across the globe in every single aspect in every single industry. And because of this, I think the other thing that's actually driving, sort of, in my opinion, what's all these things are causing this thing called the rise of the platform sort of business and the platform economy. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, right? So in recent years, more and more businesses are shifting from the pipeline structure to the platform structure. This actually comes from the book, The Platform Revolution. And why is this important, right? This is important because if you think about the biggest companies on the planet that have actually arisen over the last 20 years or so, 15 to 20 years, they're actually all platform businesses, right? Think about this, all platform businesses. Definition of the platform business, you build a platform so other businesses can actually build businesses on top of your platform, and then you take a cut. It's like the sort of like near rentier class. And so, you know, Sangeet Chowdhury says, you are either a platform business or you're a platform-enabled business. And actually, both businesses are fine, but if you think about what is actually driving most of the valuations of the publicly traded companies, they're actually platform businesses. They're not the platform-enabled businesses. And so you can build a nice business on top of a platform, but remember, if you piss them off, they can cut you off, right? So who do you think actually has more power in the world right now, right? It's actually the platform businesses. And so that's actually, if you're seeing a lot of things are actually, a lot of the fast emerging businesses, even in Silicon Valley, they're actually all platform businesses. And so it's good to understand this business model. And the other thing that I should think about, you know, in light of like all these things are happening, in light of just a crazy competition that's actually happening right now, you know, Gary Vaynerchuk, anyone know Gary Vaynerchuk? Has anyone heard of him? No, he's a social media guy, right? But you know, it's actually an interesting story. So he says it has this great quote, which is every single one of you is a media company. I think this is actually relevant whether you are an employee at a corporation. I think this is relevant whether you're a startup, whether you are actually an individual contributor. This is actually all relevant to stand out. And I think the point he's actually trying to make is that, you know, in light of like all these different platforms actually emerging, you know, he's actually one of the best examples of someone who's actually taken advantage of all these great emerging platforms. So he actually built an entire business on top of, so he started, his dad, just to give you a quick story, his dad was an offline wine store, right? And what he did when he inherited this thing, he actually utilized a lot of the online mediums of like YouTube and Twitter and all the social media to actually turn that business from a $15 million business to $50 to $60 million business by leveraging this new platform. He was also very, very smart about the fact that he became an expert in social media. So he wrote a bunch of books. He started consulting for a lot of large companies. And now he actually runs VaynerMedia, which is one of the best and fastest growing agencies that works with a lot of emerging brands and works with a lot of new companies. And they're doing close to $200 to $300 million a year of business right now. And so he is actually a great example of someone who's actually taken advantage of the rise of these platforms. So I'm going to talk about the future now. Future is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. There's Arthur C. Clarke. And so voice, this is one of the trends that I'm actually super, super excited about, right? Voice, I think, is going to be the next UX. It's starting to be the next UX. It already is, right? And if you look at the adoption of actually, like, you know, a lot of these voice devices, Amazon Echo is one of the fastest growing devices. And why is this important, right? Amazon Alexa is ultimately the Trojan horse, right? And so this is going to be like, if you think about what search actually did to sort of cut out a lot of the brands and products, they're going to become the choke point. And this is the same thing with the Amazon Alexa, right? So you talk about the fact that you want to order sort of facial moisturizer for men. This is an example. at the end of the day, you're not mentioning a brand. Amazon can basically slide in any product that they actually want that fits that criteria. And so for me, as a consumer, this is actually like interesting because like, hey, as long as you get my product, I ultimately don't really care. I think as the ultimate product owner and brand, I would be really, really terrified by the fact that Amazon as a platform can actually cut you out. Google Home, and this is actually one of the reasons that Google Home is actually, they're pushing very, very hard. All the major tech players are pushing hard in the voice space because they don't want to be cut out. Internet of Things, right? This is, if you think about Google Home, is an extension of, the reality that everything is going to become smart. And so the growth of the Internet of Things, everything, chairs, there's going to be sensors on everything, right? And this ultimately will make every single device that we're used to, things that used to be dumb devices, or not even devices, dumb objects, are going to become smart, right? And the ramifications of this, for example, in the healthcare industry, ramifications in fintech, ramifications on really anything are going to be huge. Growing very, very quickly. And all of this stuff is going to generate a crap ton of data. And data is ultimately the new oil, right? And so the other thing, right, think about who are the most dominant companies, should be very, very obvious. The people who actually own the data, right? Facebook, Google, Amazon, Alibaba. And then you're like, well, how does this affect me? This does affect you. Because, for example, if you happen to be a bank, I would be running scared. Do you know what one of the fastest and biggest financial organizations in the world that didn't actually really exist even 10 years ago? Ant Financial. Does anyone know Ant Financial? They're actually out of China. From Alibaba. Actually, Alibaba owns and invested in them. Because what they found out was that, well, wait a minute. If our job is to basically, our mission is to help small businesses, the reality is that we actually have, because we own this platform and we can see all the transactions, everything that's actually happening with these small businesses. And right now, these small businesses are having a hard time getting loans because a lot of the old banks are big, dumb, stupid, and don't have a lot of the information and data on these new emerging players. We do. We know exactly how much transactions they actually push through every single day, every single month. And so it's actually easy for us to actually extend some money to them and have much better sort of data source. Because it's better data source, we have much higher understanding of their credit worthiness. Pretty scary. They're one of the fastest growing, sort of like banks in emerging markets. This is happening. What is going to be scary is also Amazon. How much information does Amazon actually have in, at least in most countries? Pretty scary of the stuff that they can actually do with this. Don't be surprised if they actually go into the banking industry someday. Artificial intelligence, this is a future trend, so I have to talk about artificial intelligence. At the end of the day, artificial intelligence is machine learning, right? So you can have all this great data, and this is actually, if you look at the big players in the world, like the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, they actually have a huge edge. Microsoft's, they actually have a huge edge over anybody else because it doesn't matter if you have great algorithms. If you don't have access to the data, you cannot create artificial intelligence. Without this information and data to access, you can't create artificial intelligence. And consequently, a lot of VCs like myself are trying to invest into AI overall, new AI startups. And so 2016, numbers over $5 billion. I believe the number in 2017 was probably about $6 or $7 billion, probably a little bit more than that. And so this is going to continue. And if you think about also the aspects of where AI is actually going, like this is Go, not chess, right? It is no surprise that sort of things like AI could actually beat humans in things like chess, right? Chess, there's actually set rules. The fact that they can actually beat people in Go, which is no set rules, and it's a very sort of like fast-changing, I'd say much faster-changing game, should scare all of us who are white-collar workers. And so, I'm totally frightened by this, right? And so if you think about the mass impact that this AI, as it rolls out over the next 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, the biggest role that's actually going to impact us, it's going to impact all of us, lawyers, bankers, we're all in big trouble. And so, I'm going to talk about the far, far future. Here's this term called the singularity, right? So by 2030s, non-biological of our intelligence will predominate. When you talk to a human in 2035, you'll be talking to someone that's a combination of biological and non-biological intelligence. What does this actually mean? So singularity, right? So this guy named Ray Kurzweil, he's a brilliant author, works at Google. He's one of the best sort of thinkers around. And his view is that if you think about what's happening with devices, think about the fact that most of us now are pretty much augmented humans, right? And what do I mean by augmented humans? Think what Google has actually done. Think about what smartphones have actually done, right? The reality is you don't really need to remember anything anymore. You have any questions, you go to Google, right? Like we're augmented people. And think about what's going to happen in the future when you actually, right now, like I said, the fact is we have some level of embedded tech already. It's not that far off that there's going to be embedded tech in your brain. And if you look at companies, Elon Musk, if he makes it through the whole Tesla crisis, will be very, very well positioned. He's actually started a company in this area. Now the guy named Brian Johnson, he actually sold Braintree to PayPal for $800, $900 million, started a VC fund called the OS Fund, started a company that raised $30 or $40 million called Kernel, which is actually about embedded technology in your brain. So this stuff is real. It's actually happening. And so a couple key lessons. I have a couple minutes left. Key lessons is sort of how you keep on top of these trends, right? Number one, listen to VCs, of course, right? Because this is actually our job to invest into trends in the future. And a lot of the things that VCs are investing in, might not show up for 5 years, for 10 years, but if you keep track of a lot of these investing trends, it helps you. You'll kind of get a sense of what's going on, right? The other thing, watch asynchronous versus synchronous communications, right? Synchronous is basically I call you, we talk, versus say, for example, things like Snapchat, which is you send this thing and people could get it some other time, or even WhatsApp to some extent, right? I actually watch the communication space very, very, if you look at a lot of the emerging platforms, they really are in this sort of like the communication space, and there's a combination of these type of synchronous and asynchronous communications. And if you think about communications platforms, they all eventually become commerce platforms. And so it's just fun to watch these type of things. The other thing, too, is watch the kids' usage, right? Your children's usage, Generation Z, they're the earliest and fastest adopters of technology because they've grown up with it, right? Many of us, I'm a baby boomer. Not a baby, I'm a Generation X. My parents are baby boomers. And I grew up without a lot of these technologies. I actually sort of came to these technologies in my teens, right? Versus sort of this younger generation, which actually grew up with it all around them. And so it's interesting watching, particularly young sort of tweens, female tweens. They tend to be way earlier adopters than most folks. The other thing, watching emerging markets. Emerging markets are really, really interesting. Like, for example, places like China and Africa, mainly because of the fact that you're like, why do I watch them? They're not advanced. Well, what's happening is that they're leapfrogging because they didn't have a lot of the core infrastructure that we all used to have in the EU and the US. They've been able to skip a lot of these applications. So, for example, a lot of like financial sort of payment services, they've been able to skip, right? Like skip generations, infrastructure, to put in the latest infrastructure in. And so watching what's happening in this region is also a great way to see what's coming in. And of course, the other thing that you do is you watch the super advanced countries, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, which have crazy broadband, right? I remember like when I was at Yahoo and we're like looking at like the definition of broadband in the US was like, like 50 megabytes per second, right? In Korea, it's like 12 gigs per second. They're just so far ahead of us. And because of this fast, massively fast infrastructure and broadband, they're able to adopt a lot of the trends that actually happen in Korea, probably happen 2 or 3 years before it actually reaches the rest of the world. And so this is for what I do, which I'm very, very privileged to do, to be able to spend a lot of time watching sort of emerging markets, watching a lot of sort of demographic changes, and also watching a lot of the things that are actually happening in the advanced world. And because of this, I can put together sort of this puzzle. And hopefully, this gives you at least some puzzle pieces to think about your future and your company's future. And so thank you very much for giving me the time, and I hope this was interesting.